Hey guys, this is Eckhartsladder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars gaming video over here on EcksToo. So before we get started, just a reminder that if you want to throw a little extra support towards the channel, there is an EcksToo Patreon. There will be a lot of really cool benefits for anyone who decides to support the channel, including an exclusive newsletter, merchandise you won't be able to get anywhere else, and of course guaranteed spots and playing with fans and other community events. So if you're interested, consider checking out the link down in the description. So there was a lot lost when Disney purchased Lucasfilm. On the book side, we lost basically everything after Fate of the Jedi. We know that there was going to be a new story trilogy called Sword of the Jedi about Jaina Solo. We know that Troy Denning was also working on a second trilogy set sometime after Crucible, but it wasn't just books, it was also potential TV shows, and as we'll be discussing today, video games. So everyone knows already about Star Wars 1313. That video game would have seen the player explore the undercity of Coruscant, traveling into the depths, and probably finding some really interesting and disturbing locations. However, 1313 was not the only video game lost during the Disney acquisition. There was also the untitled Darth Maul project that was being worked on for LucasArts, which never saw the light of day after the Disney purchase. So Darth Maul is a very different character in Star Wars Legends, and a big part of this is the fact that he never actually dies. Star Wars Rebels didn't exist in the Legends era, so we don't have that amazing scene on Tatooine. Instead, his fate is sort of unknown. Now, technically, as I covered in a video over on Eckhartsladder, he is technically brought back to life to face against Darth Vader in the Star Wars Tales series. However, even with that said, we don't know exactly what happened to the original Darth Maul. This was a question that presumably would have been answered by the Darth Maul video game, which would have been a completely different experience to almost anything LucasArts had put out in the past decade. This Darth Maul video game had direct input by George Lucas and would have not only tied together various parts of Star Wars Legends in really interesting ways, but may have even teased the future of Star Wars Episode 7, as George Lucas saw it. What do I mean? Well, let me explain. After the fall of Palpatine in Legends, there are various Sith groups that rise up. The most prominent of those would be the One Sith, as led by Darth Krayt. Darth Krayt is actually a really interesting character in Legends because his rise to power in the Legacy era is teased in both Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi, but he essentially establishes a new rule of Sith, the One Sith. Instead of the rule of two, which saw a master and an apprentice, the One Sith saw an entire Sith order coming together behind a single person. Darth Krayt, who was the leader of the One Sith, would play a role in defeating Abeloth. He would sort of be a shadowy figure in the years after the Battle of Endor, and he would rise to power about 100 years after the Star Wars trilogy. Why is this relevant, you might be asking? Well, because Battle of the Sith Lords, or whatever name the crew would have chosen for the Darth Maul video game, would have featured the One Sith and perhaps even Darth Krayt himself. Dan Borth, who worked on the Maul game, actually gave a Reddit AMA where he gave a lot of details of the behind-the-scene production for the game, including how George Lucas helped develop and define the story and how he placed it in a sort of weird area in the Star Wars timeline. Dan, who went by the Reddit name Rancor Lover, describes the final story that Lucas approved for the game as challenging, to say the very least. And it does seem like George had a lot more input and control over the story than one would expect. Not because George Lucas couldn't pull rank if he wanted to, but just generally George doesn't seem like a person who's very interested in the intricacies of the Star Wars expanded universe, and especially things like video games. Dan explains that George was very insistent that Darth Talon would play a role in the story, and that as the player you would team up with her. Now, obviously there's some major issues with this, particularly around timelines, so what might have happened was that the main character would either shift to be, or would always be, not Darth Maul himself, but perhaps a descendant or a disciple. He says, the story we came up with was that Maul was against the idea that there could be thousands of Sith warriors, so he was completely against the new One Sith. His allegiance with Talon was to benefit himself and get close to destroy them all. His character had to be an atheist about the Sith and lost his faith, or a fundamentalist about it and go back to the rule of two. So basically, Darth Maul would have been directly interacting with some of the major players of the Star Wars Legacy era? Well, either Darth Maul or some heir who the player would have taken the role of. You may notice a bit of uncertainty or even contradictions in some of the information that I'm giving you guys, and that's because the story was never really settled 100%, and I don't think the plan of bridging that gap was ever set in stone. So let me know what you guys think in the chat. Would you prefer Darth Maul to somehow survive 200 years, or would you rather he take on some sort of apprentice, which the player would then assume control of? The interesting thing about this era, however, is that because there are so many Sith under the one Sith, Maul would have a lot of potential enemies to fight, and new characters mentioned include Darth Krone and Darth Inexor. We know nothing about these Sith, but they would have been potential enemies and victims of Darth Maul. Alright, so you may be wondering, I mentioned earlier that this could tie in with the sequel trilogy as envisioned by George Lucas, and we know that George Lucas was working on a Star Wars 7, 8, and 9. How does this work? Well, it seems like George may have been a little bit enamored by Darth Talon, and in fact, one of the coolest Star Wars books to come out in the last decade is actually the art for The Force Awakens. If you read that book, you can see a lot about the early visions for the movie, many of which actually line up decently well with what happened, but one thing that I think is really interesting is that George wanted to bring Darth Talon, again, as she existed in Star Wars Legends, into the sequel trilogy. Now, it's unclear whether this would have been the same Darth Talon, probably not. It seems like George was just kind of in love with the design, but had she been brought in any substantial way, that could have been an interesting connection with the Darth Maul game and perhaps even the Star Wars Legends expanded universe. Now, I've always been of the mind that George Lucas probably would have just completely ignored and even wiped the Star Wars expanded universe before creating new movies, but there is also the potential that he would have just kept it in the background, maybe tried to fit the parts of the EU that he liked in with his new movie trilogy. We'll never know, however, because Disney bought Lucasfilm, they bought LucasArts, and this project, George Lucas's sequel trilogy, and basically a whole lot of other stuff was just disappeared into the unknown. But that's all I have for you guys today. Let me know what you think of this potential video game. Would it have been good? Is there a possibility that we'll ever get something like this under EA's tutelage of the Star Wars brand? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. Till next time, guys, this has been Eckhartsladder. As always, be safe, and may the Force be with you.